Ready for a trip down the annals of history? We are headed for a time when people had incestuous relationships within their circles. Curious to know why it happened and what disastrous effects it had on them? Here is a comprehensive list of the most inbred people in history. Number 14. Ludwig II of Bavaria. Also known as the Mad King, Ludwig II of Bavaria is a fascinating historical figure known for his eccentric personality and troubled reign. Well, you might also have heard about his grand architectural projects like the Neuschwanstein Castle, but you get the idea. Another reason why he goes down in history, however, is for being an inbred individual. At this point, we will mention that this will be a recurring theme here. First, we will consider the broader extent of European royal families at the time. You see, it was common for monarchs to marry within royal or noble families. The most important reason why they did this was to maintain alliances. Unfortunately, this led to a high degree of consanguinity or blood relations among royals. Never heard that word before? Consanguinity is a term that has been used to describe the relationship between individuals who share a common ancestor. Basically, this means that the two individuals in question are blood relatives. You could also call it the measure of the degree of genetic relatedness between people. And that's because the term is often used in genetics and biology to describe how closely related individuals are within a family tree. In human society, consanguinity most often comes up in discussions of marriage and reproduction. Considering that marriages between close relatives are considered consanguineous, what are the actual numbers? We typically have siblings sharing about 50% of their genes. It's the same way first cousins share about 12.5% of their genes, while second cousins share about 3.125% of their genes. The problem is, high degrees of consanguinity can increase the likelihood of genetic disorders being passed on to offspring. You see, both parents may carry the same harmful recessive genes inherited from a common ancestor. We know better now, but back then they didn't. In historical and royal contexts, consanguinity was common due to political marriages within limited social circles. Without realizing it, this led to inbreeding and increased risks of hereditary diseases. Ludwig II came from the Wittelsbach dynasty, one of the oldest ruling families in Europe. This family was known for intermarriage with other European royals. Back to Ludwig II, his mother, Princess Marie of Prussia, and his father, King Maximilian II of Bavaria, were first cousins. This practice increased the likelihood of genetic problems associated with inbreeding. From mental to physical illness, some of Ludwig's behavior has since been attributed to genetic factors that were possibly exacerbated by inbreeding. It is now believed that he showed signs of eccentricity, reclusiveness, and delusional thinking. Whatever his symptoms might have been, it was so severe that it led to his eventual deposition on grounds of mental illness. Although modern historians have also considered the possibility of other causes like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or the stress and isolation of his royal duties, they still cannot prove that inbreeding was not behind it. In terms of physical traits, inbreeding in royal families often resulted in distinctive appearances. But Ludwig is not known for having any of the extreme physical characteristics that are sometimes associated with inbreeding. Yes, you may be shocked to find that there are distinctive features common with inbred individuals. One such would be the pronounced Habsburg jaw found in some inbreeding royal families. Number 13. Neanderthals. Homo neanderthals were an extinct species or subspecies of archaic humans that lived in Eurasia from around 400,000 to roughly 40,000 years ago. They may have coexisted with early modern humans, Homo sapiens, and shared many physical and cultural characteristics with them. While this may be true, it is still important to note that they were a distinct branch of the human evolutionary tree. As you can imagine, this early species had the tendency to inbreed. To analyze this inbreeding trait, we would consider factors like their environmental, social, and population dynamics. To begin with, Neanderthals lived in small, dispersed groups, often in harsh Ice Age environments. Like we mentioned earlier, this was primarily across Europe and parts of Asia. Their physical adaptations were short, stocky bodies, as well as strong and robust bones. Notably, these features helped them survive the cold climates. For survival, they were hunter-gatherers who used sophisticated tools made from stone, wood, and bone. Over the years, archaeologists have discovered pretty interesting facts about this extinct species. For one, they had evidence of cultural practices such as burial rites, fire use, and even some form of symbolic art. The Neanderthal society is believed to have been close-knit with small groups of related individuals. The fossil record suggests that Neanderthals experienced frequent injuries, possibly from hunting large animals in close proximity. This, combined with a high mortality rate, likely kept their population size relatively low. Another significant thing we have since discovered is inbreeding. Genetic studies of Neanderthal remains have revealed evidence of significant inbreeding. Before we get into the effects, let us consider why. First reason that comes to mind would be the small population size. Neanderthal populations were never very large, and they often lived in isolated pockets. As you would guess, a smaller gene pool would lead to fewer opportunities to mate outside one's immediate family group, making inbreeding more likely. Another reason would be their geographic isolation. The geographic Neanderthals lived across wide and often fragmented territories. Many groups would have been geographically isolated from one another due to natural barriers like mountains, rivers, and glaciers. With a restricted gene flow between groups, the likelihood of mating within their immediate social group increased as well. Like many early hominins, Neanderthals likely lived in small, family-based bands. This would have increased the chances of mating between close relatives, particularly if group sizes were small and mating options were limited. Given their environment, high mortality rates from hunting, accidents, and disease would have reduced the number of potential mates within a group. As a result, Neanderthals may have had to rely on close kin to maintain their populations, even if that led to inbreeding. Wondering if there were any consequences of this inbreeding? Well, you bet there was. Inbreeding reduced genetic diversity and also made the populations more susceptible to disease and genetic disorders. Genetic studies have shown that Neanderthals had a lower level of genetic diversity compared to modern humans, and some individuals exhibited evidence of close familial mating. Inbreeding can lead to the expression of harmful recessive traits, which could have contributed to health problems in Neanderthals. For example, in cases studied, we have seen skeletal abnormalities and reduced fertility. If these things might have occurred, they definitely weakened the population's resilience. To be fair, Neanderthal inbreeding was not necessarily a choice for them. It was more of a consequence of the ecological and demographic realities that they faced. With a sparse population spread over vast areas, it was difficult for Neanderthals to find unrelated mates, leading to more inbreeding. Limited contact between different groups meant less opportunity for outbreeding, and of course, the smaller social circles forced individuals to mate within their immediate kin. You can see that in such small, isolated groups, inbreeding might have been necessary to ensure the survival of the group and to maintain a stable population. One question most people ask is if inbreeding had a hand in Neanderthal extinction. It is a good question, considering all the bad that could come from the practice. But while inbreeding could have contributed to Neanderthal decline by reducing their genetic health, it was likely not the sole cause of their extinction. Other factors, such as competition with modern humans, climate change, and resource scarcity, played more significant roles. Genetic evidence shows that Neanderthals interbred with modern humans to some extent, and as a result, traces of Neanderthal DNA remain in the genomes of non-African humans today. Number 12. The Colt family. This one right here is a notorious and disturbing example of multi-generational incest and extreme neglect. The case of the Colt family was just that bad. The family came to public attention in 2012 in New South Wales, Australia, after it was discovered that several generations of family members had been engaging in incestuous relationships. It was shocking to see how these relationships led to severe consequences for their physical and mental health. Now known as the Colt family to protect the identities of the children, they lived in rural and remote areas of Australia. The family members spanned 4 generations and had engaged in incestuous relationships for decades. It was a closed, isolated family system where intermarriage between siblings, uncles, aunts, and cousins became the norm. Even worse, the living conditions were found to be extremely poor, with the children showing signs of neglect, malnutrition, lack of education, and poor hygiene. Many of the children and adults had little to no contact with the outside world, leaving them cut off from any kind of intervention that might have prevented the cycle of incest from continuing. Wondering why this happened? Well, one could blame it on the isolation. The family lived in a remote and secluded environment, far from any oversight by social services, law enforcement, or other forms of public scrutiny. It's also likely that patterns of abuse, neglect, and incest were passed down through the family. The family's origins appear to have involved an initial incestuous relationship, and this behavior was normalized over generations. Children growing up in such a disconnected environment may have seen no alternative. And for the curious minds, they were likely coerced into continuing these relationships. The Colt family members also lacked basic education, so they basically had very limited knowledge of social norms outside their immediate family. Without external influences to break the cycle, the family became trapped in a pattern of incestuous behavior. Poverty also played its part. The fact that the family had to rely on each other for survival could have reinforced their insular relationships. Sadly, all that inbreeding in the Colt family had severe and visible consequences, both physically and mentally. Many of the children showed signs of physical deformities and congenital conditions, likely resulting from inbreeding. Genetic disorders become more prevalent when closely related individuals reproduce because recessive genes, which might carry harmful traits, are more likely to pair up. The children in the family were reported to have significant cognitive impairments. Many of them had speech difficulties, lacked basic motor skills, and were delayed in their development. These issues were exacerbated by their lack of education and the neglect they experienced from an early age. Growing up in an environment where abuse, neglect, and incest were normalized almost certainly led to severe psychological trauma. Many of the children and adults likely experienced depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as well as difficulties forming healthy relationships or understanding boundaries. The extreme isolation of the family meant that the children had no experience with socializing outside of their immediate family. This caused severe social dysfunction, making it difficult for them to interact with the world once authorities intervened. That said, they lacked the basic social skills needed to navigate normal human relationships. Thankfully, it all came to an end in 2012. The Colt family came to the attention of authorities after reports of child neglect surfaced. Upon investigation, social workers and law enforcement discovered the appalling living conditions and the intergenerational incest. Number 11. Kingston Clan. Also known as the Davis County Cooperative Society, the Kingston Clan is a fundamentalist Mormon group based in Utah. Sadly, they are now notorious for practicing polygamy and inbreeding within their pool community. Notably, the group is part of the broader religious tradition of the Latter-day Saints, LDS. However, they have diverged significantly from mainstream Mormonism, particularly in their adherence to polygamy and strict beliefs about bloodlines. As you will see, the clan's practice of inbreeding played a major role in shaping both their social structure and the health outcomes of their members. But let's back up a bit to truly understand how they got there. The Kingston Clan was founded in the 1930s by Charles W. Kingston. The idea was a system of polygamy and communal living that they believe is ordained by God. The group was estimated to have about 3,000 to 5,000 members. One thing its leadership claimed was divine authority and a mission to maintain pure bloodlines. So to achieve this, they encouraged marriages within the group, most times between cousins and other close relatives. This is in line with their belief that they are chosen by God to uphold a superior lineage, referred to as the Order. Considering this superiority was one of the central beliefs of the Kingston clan, the encouragement of marriages within the family aligned with their interpretation of religious texts. These guys really thought, what better way to maintain our elite status in the eyes of God? We can't also rule out the practice of polygamy within the Kingston clan. Many men in the group have multiple wives, often from within the clan itself. This, of course, led to a smaller gene pool. The clan leaders exert tight control over marriages, frequently arranging them between relatives to reinforce family ties and maintain power within a small circle. The Kingston clan operates in a secretive and insular manner, discouraging members from interacting with outsiders. This isolation reduces the likelihood of marrying outside the group, further promoting inbreeding. Social and psychological pressures make it difficult for members to leave, creating a closed system where marriage choices are highly restricted. There's also this thing with absolute obedience. Members are expected to follow the orders of the group's leaders, including directives about marriage. Women, in particular, have little agency in choosing their spouses and are often married off to male relatives in polygamous arrangements. As you would expect, the inbreeding within the Kingston clan has had a range of detrimental genetic and social effects. There were reports of serious genetic conditions within the Kingston clan. From birth defects to developmental delays and other health issues, children born to close relatives are at higher risk of inheriting 2 copies of defective genes. One notable example is fumarase deficiency, a rare genetic disorder that has appeared in some members of the Kingston clan. This condition leads to severe cognitive and physical impairments. As observed in the Kingston clan, children have been reported to suffer from developmental challenges due to their parents being close relatives. The closed, controlling nature of the Kingston clan has led to widespread reports of abuse, including the sexual abuse of young girls who are coerced into marrying older male relatives. This kind of trauma has long-lasting psychological effects, with many former members who have left the group reporting experiences of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The Kingston clan's practices eventually attracted attention from both law enforcement and child welfare authorities. The Kingston clan faced several legal challenges over the years, with some members being prosecuted for welfare fraud, child abuse, and other criminal activities. Considering the group practiced polygamy and arranged marriages between close relatives, it has come under scrutiny for violating laws related to incest and child welfare. Number 10. Ancient Hawaiian royal family. Widely known as the Ali'i, the ancient Hawaiian royal family practiced inbreeding or incestuous marriage. Was it a means of preserving the sacredness and purity of their chiefly bloodlines? Or did they do this for the fun of it? Wouldn't you like to know? Well, this practice was deeply rooted in their religious, social, and political structures. That said, let's begin with the Ali'i class and the importance of the bloodline as they saw it. In ancient Hawaiian society, the Ali'i were the ruling chiefs, and they were believed to be the descendants of the gods. Their divine status and power were directly tied to the concept of kapu, meaning sacredness, and the purity of their bloodline. The Ali'i Nui, the high chiefs, held the highest social rank and were responsible for governing the islands, overseeing religious ceremonies, and maintaining order. The belief in the divine origin of the Ali'i meant that maintaining a pure, untainted bloodline was essential to preserving their sacred status. The closer one lineage was to the gods, the higher their spiritual power and authority. As a result, incestuous marriages between close relatives, including siblings, cousins, or uncles and nieces, were seen as a way to strengthen and elevate the family's spiritual power. Let's consider the Kamehameha dynasty. King Kamehameha I unified the Hawaiian Islands in the late 18th century and was of high-ranking Ali'i blood. So his descendants continued the practice of intra-family marriages to maintain the family's divine and political legitimacy. This divine right was called mana. The Ali'i aimed above all else to keep their mana strong. Marrying outside the royal family could dilute their divine power and lessen their authority. Only through intermarriage with close relatives could they ensure that their offspring would carry the same or even greater divine right to rule. Power consolidation was a thing too. Inbreeding within the royal family helped to prevent rival claims to the throne and equally strengthened alliances within the family. It allowed the royal family to maintain its power and prevent other noble families from rising in influence. Keeping power concentrated within a small circle of blood relatives minimized threats from external factions. Hawaiian culture placed great emphasis on genealogy and rank, and incestuous marriages were part of their traditional social structure. High-ranking marriages were not only accepted but celebrated as a means of preserving the sacred order. This practice also existed in other Polynesian societies where chiefs and royals married close relatives to maintain rank. As with any population that practices inbreeding, there was a risk of increased genetic disorders. Inbreeding concentrates on recessive genes that can result in congenital health issues. While specific cases of genetic disorders within the Hawaiian royal family are not well documented, the possibility of inherited conditions and weakened offspring existed, as has been seen in other royal families that practiced similar customs. Although inbreeding served to maintain political power within the royal family, it also led to instability of some sort. As fewer individuals were eligible to marry, succession disputes and competition for power became more intense. The emphasis on maintaining pure bloodlines meant that the royal family was resistant to alliances or marriages with outsiders. This may have limited their ability to build broader political coalitions or adapt to external pressures, such as those brought by European colonizers. By the time of Western contact, the rigid social hierarchy based on divine bloodlines was increasingly challenged by new ideas of governance and authority. When European and American traders, missionaries, and settlers arrived in Hawaii in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, they brought with them new ideas about marriage, governance, and religion. The practice of incestuous royal marriages, which had been culturally accepted in Hawaiian society, was viewed as taboo and immoral by Western standards. Missionaries introduced Christian values that condemned incestuous relationships. This began to influence Hawaiian culture and led to changes in marriage practices, especially among the ruling class. Over time, the pressure from Western colonizers and missionaries to conform to Christian morality contributed to the decline of traditional royal marriage customs. The Kingdom of Hawaii was eventually overthrown in 1893 by a group of American businessmen with support from the U.S. government. By this time, the traditional system of ali'i power based on bloodlines had been severely weakened by both internal and external factors. Number 9. Ferdinand I of Austria, 1793 to 1875. This was the lifetime of Ferdinand I of Austria. At some point, he was the emperor of the Austrian Empire from 1835 to 1848. While he did a lot in his lifetime, his reign and life have often been remembered through the lens of inbreeding. He was part of the Habsburg family, a European royal dynasty that is notorious for its long history of intermarriage within the family. As you can imagine, this practice of inbreeding is aimed at consolidating power and maintaining political alliances. The Habsburgs are one of the most powerful and influential families in European history. They ruled vast territories in Europe for centuries. Sadly, to maintain their control over these regions, they frequently arranged marriages between close relatives, such as cousins and uncles with nieces. Over generations, this resulted in a significant degree of inbreeding. The Habsburgs intermarried primarily to preserve their extensive holdings and maintain political unity within the family. The Habsburgs ruled over a vast and fragmented empire, including lands in Central Europe, Spain, the Netherlands, and parts of Italy. By intermarrying within the family, they prevented the fragmentation of their territories and avoided potential conflicts with other royal houses. By keeping marriages within the family, they avoided alliances with rival dynasties and kept wealth and power concentrated in their hands. However, this strategy came with genetic costs. Inbreeding increases the likelihood that recessive genetic traits will be expressed. Over time, this led to a number of hereditary conditions becoming common in the Habsburg family. Among them were physical deformities. Ferdinand I was a clear example of the harmful effects of centuries of inbreeding within the Habsburg family. He suffered from numerous physical and intellectual disabilities. Ferdinand was born with multiple congenital disorders. He suffered from epilepsy, and his frequent seizures were a significant challenge throughout his life. He also had a large, oversized head, a condition that is likely related to the family's inbreeding practices. Which brings us to the hydrocephalus. This is basically water in the brain. As a result, Ferdinand was intellectually limited, with many historians describe him as having mental disabilities. He was slow to learn and had difficulty speaking coherently. His cognitive limitations were well known at the time, and they led to significant concerns about his ability to rule effectively as emperor. Ferdinand's disabilities meant that, during his reign, he was essentially a figurehead. His ministers and advisors, particularly Prince Metternich, wielded real power. Ferdinand was not capable of making independent political decisions, and his government was largely controlled by a council of regents. The most famous physical trait associated with Habsburg inbreeding is the Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, which caused an elongated jaw and a prominent lower lip. While Ferdinand I did not exhibit the extreme version of this trait, other members of the family, such as Charles II of Spain, did. Ferdinand's epilepsy and hydrocephalus were likely the result of genetic weaknesses caused by inbreeding. Ferdinand I ruled from 1835 to 1848, but his reign was marked by unrest, most notably the revolutions of 1848, which swept through Europe. If anything, the revolutions highlighted the empire's instability and led to Ferdinand's abdication in favor of his nephew, Franz Joseph I. After abdicating, Ferdinand lived in relative seclusion, away from political life, until his death in 1875. Number 8. Ancient Irish Royals. The ancient Irish royals, particularly the ruling dynasties of Gaelic Ireland, are also worthy of mention when it comes to the practice of inbreeding. Though not necessarily to the same degree as other European royal families like the Habsburgs, they were also guilty. Let's begin with the structure of ancient Irish society. The ancient Irish society was divided into several clans called Tuatha. Each one was ruled by a king known as a Rí Tuatha for smaller regions, or Rí Ruaidh for kings of larger areas. These kings were seen as semi-sacred leaders who derived their power from their ancestors and the gods. Notably, the importance of kinship, lineage, and maintaining noble bloodlines was central to the political and social structure of Gaelic Ireland. Kingship in ancient Ireland was passed down through certain royal families or clans, with a great emphasis on the purity of these lineages. The royal families claimed descent from ancient, often mythical, ancestors, which gave them legitimacy to rule. Marriage in ancient Ireland was a strategic tool used to cement alliances between noble families. As such, the royal family needed to do it differently. For the royal family, marriages often took place within the extended family, such as between cousins, all in a bid to prevent wealth and power from leaving the family. The primary reason for intermarriage among the ruling elite was to keep land, wealth, and titles within the family. By marrying relatives, royal families ensured that their estates would not be divided or taken over by other clans, thus preserving the unity and strength of the family. Royal families would often arrange marriages between cousins or other relatives to consolidate alliances within the clan or with neighboring clans. These alliances strengthened their political influence and provided greater military and economic power. Gaelic Ireland also had a distinctive kinship structure where extended family relationships were highly valued, and marriage between cousins was not seen as taboo. The Gaelic Irish nobility often arranged marriages to maintain the strength and purity of their family lineage, which was believed to have a direct impact on the legitimacy of their rule. Sadly, this led to political fragmentation. While inbreeding was meant to preserve power within a family, it may have also contributed to internal divisions within clans. As power became concentrated within a small group of interrelated families, disputes over succession and control of resources arose. At the end of the day, it weakened the overall stability of the clan. In Irish history, there are many examples of intense feuds within royal families, and they sometimes escalated into violence or civil war. This concentration of power also led to rigid social hierarchies and a lack of political flexibility. This made it difficult for families to adapt to changing circumstances, especially during periods of external invasion or colonization. This brings us to the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland. The period of Gaelic rule in Ireland began to decline after the 12th century. This was around the time that the Anglo-Norman invasion weakened many native Irish dynasties. As the Irish royal families were gradually absorbed into the Anglo-Norman feudal system, their power waned, and the traditional practices of marriage and lineage began to change under external influence. Under a new political landscape, the Gaelic royals' reliance on kinship ties and inbreeding diminished as they faced external pressures. New political alliances formed between the Gaelic nobles and the Anglo-Norman settlers, thereby diluting the ancient practice of inbreeding within the Irish royal families. By the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, the Gaelic aristocracy had lost much of its power, especially during the Tudor conquest of Ireland. This ended the traditional royal structures and, with it, many of the intermarriage practices that had defined the ancient Irish royals. Number 7. The Blue Fugates. The Blue Fugates of Kentucky, better known as the Fugate family, is a famous example of the consequences of inbreeding within a small, isolated population. The family became known for a rare genetic condition that caused their skin to appear blue. And we mean that literally. This is a condition known as methemoglobinemia. But of course, there's more to their story. The Fugates were a family that settled in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky in the early 19th century. The original patriarch, Martin Fugate, was a French immigrant who arrived in Kentucky in the early 1980s. He married a local woman named Elizabeth Smith, and together they had children who carried a genetic mutation that resulted in methemoglobinemia. This is a rare blood disorder that causes the blood to carry less oxygen than normal, and by doing so, gives the skin a blue tint. Normally, the amount of methemoglobin in the blood is quite low, but in individuals with the condition, the levels are significantly higher, and it leads to symptoms like cyanosis, also known as bluish skin. There's also the problem of fatigue and other symptoms of oxygen deprivation. This condition is inherited in an autosomal recessive pattern, meaning both parents must carry a copy of the mutated gene for their offspring to be affected. In most populations, this is rare because the odds of both parents carrying the same mutation are low. However, in small, isolated populations with a high degree of inbreeding, the likelihood of inheriting two copies of the same recessive gene increases. The Fugate family lived in a remote, isolated part of Kentucky where geographic and social factors led to a limited pool of marriageable individuals. The Appalachian region where the Fugates lived was rugged and mountainous. Travel was difficult, and there was limited access to other communities. As a result, families in the area tended to marry within their own community. In a setup like this, cousins marrying cousins or other close relatives was bound to happen. Over time, the gene pool became increasingly concentrated, making it more likely that individuals carrying the same recessive genes would marry and pass on genetic traits like methemoglobinemia. Because both Martin Fugate and his wife were carriers of the recessive gene for methemoglobinemia, some of their children were born with the condition. As their descendants continued to marry within the small community, the gene remained present and was passed down through successive generations. By the mid-20th century, many members of the Fugate family displayed the characteristic blue skin associated with the condition. Members of the Fugate family, particularly those who exhibited the blue skin trait, were subject to social stigmatization and isolation from wider society. The unusual appearance of the family made them a subject of curiosity and also of discrimination. In a region that was already geographically isolated, this further deepened the family's separation from others. In the 1960s, a doctor named Madison Kewin discovered that a medication known as methylene blue could treat the condition by converting methemoglobin back to normal hemoglobin, restoring the skin to its natural color. The treatment was effective and significantly reduced the blue tint in affected individuals. Number 6. Peruvian Elites. The Peruvian elites, particularly during the colonial and early republican periods, engaged in inbreeding to maintain and consolidate their power, wealth, and social status. Inbreeding among these elites, while not as extreme as in some European royal families, was a common practice aimed at preserving the purity of their Spanish lineage and controlling their economic and political influence. Notably, there was a pretty interesting historical context at play. Peru was a key part of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, with its colonial capital, Lima, serving as a major center of power for Spain. The elites in Peru were mostly peninsulars, which are Spanish-born individuals, or criollos, people of Spanish descent born in the Americas. After Peru's independence in 1821, these groups continued to dominate the political, social, and economic life of the country. In colonial Peru, peninsulars held the highest position of power, while the criollos were often excluded from the top echelons of government. However, criollos gained significant wealth through land ownership and control of industries such as mining. So after independence, the criollo class became the dominant elite. Spanish colonization in Peru introduced a rigid caste system that stratified society based on race and heritage. The top tiers were occupied by whites, the peninsular and criollos, while indigenous people, mestizos, the mixed-race individuals, and African descendants were marginalized. Maintaining the purity of Spanish bloodlines was a priority for the elites to distinguish themselves from the lower castes. The elites were highly concentrated with preserving the purity of their Spanish bloodlines. This concern stemmed from the racial hierarchies established during the colonial period, where Spanish ancestry was associated with power, privilege, and superiority. Marrying within the same elite families helped to maintain this racial and social distinction. Many elite families were landowners who controlled vast estates and lucrative mining operations. Marrying cousins or other relatives helped to keep wealth and land within the family. Since the Peruvian elite class was relatively small, intermarriage among a limited group of wealthy and influential families became a practical necessity. This isolation reinforced social barriers between the elites and the rest of the population, especially indigenous people and mestizos. But did this have positive effects? While the consolidation of power helped these families to retain control over key resources, such as land and mining operations, well into the Republican era, it also contributed to social stagnation. Opportunities for social mobility were limited as the elites became increasingly insular. Over time, the practice of inbreeding led to increased tensions within elite families. Conflicts over inheritance, marriage alliances, and control of wealth sometimes fragmented these powerful families. This division may have weakened their ability to maintain control over larger regions and diminish their collective political power, particularly during periods of social upheaval. Number 5. Charles II of Spain. Remember the Habsburgs? Well, Charles II of Spain was the last Habsburg ruler of the Spanish Empire. Sadly, he is also one of the most famous examples of the detrimental effects of inbreeding. Born into the Habsburg dynasty, which had long practiced consanguineous marriages to preserve their political power, Charles II suffered from a host of physical, mental, and developmental issues. As you will see, his life and reign were deeply affected by the severe inbreeding that had occurred over generations within the Habsburg family. Like we explained earlier, the Habsburgs were one of the most powerful royal families in Europe during the early modern period. They controlled vast territories that included Spain, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, and other regions. So, to maintain their power and keep their empire intact, the Habsburgs frequently married within their own family, often to first cousins or uncles and nieces. By the time Charles II was born, the Habsburg family had undergone multiple generations of intermarriage. His parents, Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece, meaning that Charles had a highly inbred family tree. His pedigree included a high concentration of shared ancestors, particularly through his great-great-grandparents. They were Joanna of Castile and Philip I of Castile, and they appeared multiple times in his ancestry. Charles II had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, which means that 25.4% of his genes were identical due to descent from common ancestors. For comparison, offspring of brother and sister unions typically have an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25. What this means is that Charles was genetically similar to the offspring of a sibling marriage. Charles II was profoundly affected by the consequences of inbreeding, suffering from numerous physical and developmental disorders that plagued him throughout his life. Charles II had a prominent Habsburg jaw. His lower jaw was so pronounced that he had difficulty chewing food and speaking clearly. This deformity is considered one of the most visible markers of the genetic consequences of Habsburg inbreeding. Despite being married twice, Charles II was unable to produce an heir, likely due to reproductive issues stemming from inbreeding. His infertility was a major political problem because it meant the end of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain, leading to a succession crisis that culminated in the War of the Spanish Succession after his death. If you made it this far, do hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any updates from us. Number 4. Ancient Egyptian Royal Family, Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun, also known as King Tut, was from a ruling family from the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, royal families often practiced sibling marriage, cousin marriage, or unions between close relatives. Pharaohs were considered to be gods on earth, direct descendants of the deities. Marrying within the family helped preserve the purity of this divine bloodline. Tutankhamun was the son of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who attempted to establish a monotheistic religion centered around the worship of the sun disk, Aten. Genetic testing has shown that Tutankhamun's mother was Akhenaten's sister, making Tutankhamun the product of an incestuous sibling union. Tutankhamun himself suffered from several physical ailments that are believed to be the direct result of his family's inbreeding. His premature death at around 18 or 19 years of age was likely hastened by his various genetic disorders and health issues. Analysis has shown that he likely had clubfoot, cleft palate, scoliosis, bone necrosis, and a weakened immune system. Number 3. Queen Victoria's family. Queen Victoria's family, particularly the extended network of European royalty descended from her, is a significant example of the long-term consequences of dynastic intermarriage. Known as the Grandmother of Europe because her descendants occupied numerous thrones across the continent, Queen Victoria's lineage was marked by close familial marriages, which is just another way to say inbreeding. Queen Victoria's most infamous genetic legacy was the transmission of hemophilia, a blood clotting disorder that affects males and is passed on through females as carriers. History has it that it was known as the royal disease. Hemophilia affected many of her male descendants and had far-reaching political and personal consequences. Queen Victoria herself was a carrier of hemophilia. It is believed to be the result of a spontaneous mutation, as there is no evidence of the disorder in her ancestors. Hemophilia is an X-linked recessive disorder, meaning that while women can carry the gene without exhibiting symptoms, they can pass the defective gene to their sons, who will develop the disease. Victoria passed hemophilia to several of her children, and through their marriages into other royal families, the disease spread to multiple European dynasties. Some of the most affected descendants include Leopold, the Duke of Albany, Alexei Romanov, Prince Friedrich of Hesse, and a couple more. Number 2. House of Braganza. The House of Braganza was the ruling dynasty of Portugal from the 17th century until the early 20th century. Now, a spot on this list meant that they engaged in dynastic inbreeding much like any other European royal families. The House of Braganza came to power in 1640 with John IV of Portugal declaring independence from Spain and founding the Braganza dynasty. The Braganza family ruled Portugal until the establishment of the Portuguese Republic in 1910. Still, their cadet branch, the House of Braganza, Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha, continued the lineage on the Portuguese throne until it was abolished. When it comes to inbreeding, the Braganza had their fair share of it. For instance, King João V of Portugal married his niece, Maria Anna of Austria. As with other royal families, the high degree of inbreeding in the House of Braganza had significant health implications for its members. Some descendants of the Braganza family experienced health issues that may have been exacerbated by inbreeding. Maria II of Portugal, Queen of Portugal from 1834 to 1853, had several children who died in infancy. King Peter V, her son, who ruled Portugal from 1853 to 1861, died at the young age of 24 from illness. The Braganza family, like many royal families, experienced high infant mortality rates. While infant mortality was common in the 18th and 19th century due to disease and lack of medical knowledge, inbreeding may have further weakened the immune systems of royal children, making them more susceptible to illness. Number 1. Cleopatra. Cleopatra VII, the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. We spoke about the Egyptian family, so you can already imagine that she was a product of centuries of inbreeding within the Ptolemaic royal family. The Ptolemies was a Macedonian Greek dynasty established by Ptolemy I, a general of Alexander the Great. He ruled Egypt after Alexander's death in 323 BCE. His descendants maintain a consistent policy of marrying within the family, often between siblings, to preserve the purity of their royal bloodline and keep power within the family. Cleopatra herself was born into this inbred family. Her parents were likely Ptolemy XII Auletes and possibly one of his sisters, though the identity of Cleopatra's mother is not entirely certain. Her own siblings included Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV, both of whom she married at different points in her reign to solidify her rule. Although Cleopatra was highly intelligent, politically shrewd, and charismatic, the long history of inbreeding in her family may have had certain effects on her health or her siblings. Some scholars suggest that the extensive inbreeding in the Ptolemaic family may have contributed to certain distinctive physical features, such as short stature or prominent facial characteristics, though this remains speculative. Cleopatra's depictions in Egyptian art and coins show her with a hooked nose and sharp features, though these representations may be symbolic rather than realistic. By the time of Cleopatra's rule, the Ptolemaic dynasty was in decline. Internal power struggles, Roman interference, and a weakened royal line all contributed to the collapse of the dynasty. So, what do you think? Do share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button. You also can't miss the next video on screen.